Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago campus here in Hong Kong. Welcome back to the U.S. Presidential Election Series 2024. This is the fourth episode of our webinar series, and tonight we'll discuss the resilience of American democracy post the presidential election in the United States. We'll be doing that with our faculty lead, Professor Robert Pape, and all the U Chicago political science faculty who participated in our previous episodes. Let's start with a brief introduction of our speakers. Robert Pape is Professor of Political Science and the founding director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. He specializes in international security affairs. Ruth Bloch Rubin is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. She studies the U.S. Congress, political parties, and American political history. Molly Offer-Westort is an assistant professor of political science. She also is affiliated with the Department of Statistics and the Committee on Data Science. She works on statistical methodology for social science research, which integrates machine learning with experimental design. Paul Poast is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Committee on International Relations. He studies international politics, focusing on international security, diplomacy, and the use of data to study international relations. And finally, Robert Gulotty is Associate Professor of Political Science. His research examines the relationship between national governments and global markets. You can find the links to the books each of these faculty have written and other publications on the event page for this evening's event. I just wanted to make one other note that as a reminder, all of our professors speaking tonight are featured on our podcast, The Course, which is a Hong Kong campus podcast. Please check out those interviews after the program tonight to learn more about our faculty. And I want to just thank all the professors tonight for rising so early with us, except for Molly. She has the advantage of being in Brazil, I believe. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and turn the program over to Ruth and have her get started to talk a little bit about the post-election feedback that she has for us. And then she'll turn it over to the next faculty and the next faculty, and then we'll have a moderated roundtable panel discussion after each faculty presents for about 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mark. So Molly and I are together going to talk a little bit about the domestic policy implications of the election, of which there are many, of which we can anticipate only a few at this point. We've already survived one Trump administration, so I think it's important to approach this one with a good sense of humility. But before we get started in talking about what I think was sort of surprising about the election and what perhaps got missed in a lot of our conversations prior to it, in part, some of ours, was just the sort of basic results. So as often the case, the Electoral College result, I think, made it appear that Trump had a resounding victory. He won, I think it was 312 to 226. But what we see in the popular vote is that, as the polling predicted, this was a very tight election. Harris won roughly 48% of the popular vote. Trump came in at a little bit over 49%. And so I think that suggests that even though the Electoral College result was, I think, a healthy margin, that in fact, this was as contested a race as our polling and sort of on the ground interviews suggested it would be. And we see that reflected in the state of congressional elections as well. Even though both houses moved rightward or maintained their majorities, what we see is that particularly in the House, we have the slimmest Republican majority in the history of Congress. When we have departures, two expected departures, individuals who will be joining the Trump administration, Speaker Johnson, assuming he remains Speaker, will have 218 Republicans to work with, which is the smallest majority and the bare minimum you need to legislate in the House under majority rules. In the Senate, incoming Senate Leader Thune has a healthier majority, 53 to 47, but that is by no means filibuster proof. And so he will have to operate under unanimous consent or in cooperation with Democrats unless they're able to push everything through rules called reconciliation, which means that they are able to work under majority rules, but it has to fit under certain budget strictures. So that's going to really limit Republicans' ability to legislate in either chamber. In thinking, I think about what is particularly interesting or surprising or not surprising about this election, there are a couple of things that I want to touch on. The first of which is that what we see is that and I'm going to speak as someone who's primarily interested in Congress, that there was a lot of concern among Republicans that they were going to be held accountable for a lot of the leadership woes they had in the House. For those who remember, there were a lot of turmoil in ousting Speaker McCarthy, and a conversation among many Republicans was that this was going to hurt them electorally. And with the Republican lawmakers and staff I've talked to since the election, there's a lot of confusion as to how to interpret these results. It's a very tight margin. And so some are saying that this is an indication that while the country moved right, for the most part, the House has the slimmest majority. And so that's the kind of penalty they're paying for that chaos. Others point to retaining the majority and suggest that, in fact, this endorses a similar strategy. And so Republicans should feel free to continue to have this kind of chaotic leadership in the House and not worry about the electoral repercussions. I think in terms of thinking about what to expect from the Trump administration, we're already seeing some interesting dynamics between Congress and the president in terms of the nominations that the president has made, some of which are far more controversial than others. And a real live question is just how deferential the Senate is going to be. Are Senate Republicans going to allow Trump's more non-traditional candidates through without significant interrogation, or are they going to, as has already happened with one nominee, or several under pressure as a suggestion that they might not meet this vetting, have forced them to back out and for Trump to find additional picks. And again, this, to the extent that we see that, that suggests that the sort of traditional separation of power dynamics are at work. To the extent that we see the Senate being overly deferential or quite deferential to the president, depending on your perspective, it suggests that maybe this sort of classic separation of powers dynamics that we think tend to protect our democracy might be weakened by sort of partisan ties. I don't want to take more time, so I'm going to pivot to Molly to talk about sort of more of the electoral things that we've spoken about in our prior discussions.
Great. Thanks so much for that rundown, Ruth. So we got questions about what we found most surprising about the election. And what I want to talk about specifically, following up on the last podcast that Ruth and I were on, is about information and media environments leading up to the election, particularly in terms of misinformation and social media. So before the election, I do think that researchers and analysts working on misinformation thought that misinformation would matter for this election. We know that the decentralization of information sources that's been facilitated by social media and kind of the fragmentation of media markets has meant that people can be targeted and led astray by bad actors. We've seen state-driven misinformation campaigns in the US in previous US elections, and that did happen again this year in the US. According to US security officials, Russia in particular was responsible for some false content that really gained traction in circulating. There's also some evidence of campaigns from Iran and China. However, one of the questions from the last podcast was whether misinformation would change the outcome of the election. And it is really hard to know counterfactuals in these types of situations, or even what it would mean for there to be a US presidential election without some type of misinformation. In the US, as in many places, politicians and political actors misrepresent, and they can be some of the largest sources of misinformation. Going back to 1800, newspapers spread false rumors that Thomas Jefferson had died right before the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This was potentially motivated by his opponents who wanted there to be to detract attention from celebrations of him. So there's this long and storied history in the US of media being implicated in spreading false political information in the US. So it's kind of hard to imagine what the counterfactual would be. However, coming back to this election, it doesn't seem like misinformation campaigns were pivotal in this election. So immediately after the election, Democratic staffers did cite misinformation as one of several reasons that they had failed to gain the momentum that they would have needed to win the election. But I think that this narrative has really not persisted as they have continued to kind of break down the reasons why things turned out as they did. And it does seem clear that while there was false and misleading content circulating online, people largely made political decisions on what seemed to be fairly authentic understanding of the visions that the two candidates promoted for America. So this is not to say that everyone fully understands the consequences of things like tariffs, which Bobby will talk about a bit more. But misunderstanding policy is different than misinformation. In terms of other possible surprises, there were also concerns that after the election, there would be claims that the election was stolen. Media trackers, including the BBC, saw a large wave of allegations of fraud leading up to the election and on election day, but those really peaked on the afternoon of election day and dropped dramatically as poll results were coming in. And I think given the outcome of the election, I actually don't think that this is that surprising. I don't think that we expected these claims to be symmetric between Democrats and Republicans. The idea of the election being stolen or there being widespread electoral fraud was largely a narrative that was driven by some Republican groups online. And while there were claims on election day by some Democratic actors that there might have been fraud, there wasn't any backing from Democratic politicians that would have given this the momentum to keep going. So we haven't seen those types of claims after the election. So that said, I do think that there are important consequences of misinformation and the type of information environment that we've been operating in. We're operating in a world where there's a lot of mistrust in media and there's a lot of information uncertainty. And the long-term goals of some of these misinformation campaigns is sometimes to have a specific outcome of an election, but often the goal is to generally weaken trust in media and in democratic institutions. And I do think that that has been effective and will continue to be effective. We are continuing to see the effects of ongoing media fragmentation and distrust internationally. In the Romanian presidential election, which also happened this last month, the candidate who won the plurality of the vote was a virtual unknown going into the election, but he was able to very effectively ride a viral TikTok campaign. And this type of alternative media strategy allowed him to take advantage of anti-elite sentiment while avoiding the scrutiny of traditional media. In South Korea, as we just saw extremely recently, when there was the announcement of martial law, one of the stated motivations of this was to address fake news. And in South Korea, as in other places, I think we will see that these calls to fight fake news can give leaders a justification to control the media. So I think for researchers going forward, as we think about operating in this space, it's really essential that we continue working on understanding these online spaces. And I think there's been a lot of research in the global north. It'll be important to continue trying to understand the global south as well. So I think next up on our list is Paul. Is that right?
Yes, yes, I am next. Thank you, Molly. So what I'd like to do is start to pivot our conversation a little bit to thinking about the geopolitical, the international implications of this election. I'm going to start with that, and my colleague Bobby Gulotty will then continue with that, focusing on the economic side. And I think one of the best ways to do that, at least for me, is to go back to election night, or more specifically, election morning. I was up very, very early that morning, and I was up early enough that I saw Trump's victory speech, and more importantly, I saw which world leader was the first one to actually congratulate Trump on the victory. And unsurprising to me, it was Zelensky of Ukraine. He had a very extensive pre-written congratulatory statement that was issued out talking about looking forward to working with Trump and peace through strength. And he knows that that will enable Ukraine to be able to achieve what they hope to be able to achieve and maybe haven't been able to achieve under the Biden administration. Followed very shortly by NATO's new Secretary General, Ruth, and I thought you could tell that was coordinated on their part to be ready to do this. Now, what is interesting about that is this is something that is well known about Trump, which is that Trump is someone who is very well known to be susceptible to flattery. This was the case during his first presidency. We saw that during the time where people even made the statement that then Secretary General of NATO Stoltenberg should have received the Nobel Peace Prize because of how well he handled Trump and gave Trump lots of credit for NATO spending more on defense. Whether or not Trump actually had anything to do with that didn't matter. What mattered was that Trump received credit for that. And so it already pointed to these world leaders immediately moving back into that playbook of playing to Trump. And this is really important in this particular time, because another thing that has really jumped out to me is this is a very unusual presidential transition when it comes to thinking about the foreign policy implications of it. Typically what happens is there's a president-elect and they continue, and you have a lame duck president. People know that there's a lame duck president, but they're still president and they're still working with that person. What I'm really noticing this time is a lot of world leaders already starting immediately to pivot to working with Trump. And this makes sense in several ways. This makes sense because Trump is a very, not separate from Trump himself being unusual, but the circumstances of Trump becoming president are very unusual. He's only the second individual in US history to be a president, a former president, now being president-elect, going back to Grover Cleveland. So this already puts him in a very unique situation where these world leaders already had existing relationships with Trump. They already had Trump on their phone, if you will. So the idea that they would say, okay, well, he's back now, we had a relationship before, we can start working with him, in many ways makes sense, regardless of whether it's Trump. But I think that specifically Trump as an individual makes this transition period more unusual because of what I just shared about what we saw with Zelensky. They know that with someone like Trump, you need to start talking with him right away, because in addition to Trump being susceptible to flattery, Trump is also someone who's known for doing the last thing he heard. And so you want to start talking with him early and often. So those are something that right away I am noticing. Now, the other reason why this is very unusual transition is because Trump himself during this campaign, and perhaps because of the fact that he was already president and he already knows, if you will, where the stapler is, because of the fact that he was already president, he's come in and saying before he's even inaugurated, he's going to already solve the Ukraine crisis. He's going to solve all these other global crises. And it was actually notable to me that on election night, when he gave his victory address, the very first thing he said was, I'm glad I'm reelected because we've got to solve all these wars going on around the world. I thought that was quite notable. That was the first thing he said. He didn't talk about immigration. He didn't talk about inflation. He didn't talk about that. He said, we've got to solve all these wars going on around the world. And so that jumped out to me as another thing of highlighting why this is an unusual transition, because he very much put his reputation on the fact that he can solve these things before he even actually becomes president. And we're already starting to see where this is in play. He's already having conversations with Putin. He's having conversations with Zelensky. He's having conversations with Netanyahu. His team that he's trying to pull together, which of course has a lot of implications for thinking about the direction of the foreign policy. We're already seeing where that is playing a role in shaping things. And one thing that I can say, and I'll say this before I pass it on to my colleague here, is that what we're noticing is that even if he can't address these things before he actually becomes president, and that's why the next 2 months will be very important to observe, what is clear is that the team that he's trying to put together in terms of his foreign policy team, whether it's Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, even Defense Secretary, which of course is still very much up in the air, what is very clear is that the individuals he's chosen, or even the individuals who are likely to be replacements if some of these individuals don't go through, all point towards anything but an isolationist foreign policy. Instead, what they point to is a very hawkish foreign policy, hawkish towards US allies, hawkish towards US adversaries. Everybody that he has picked so far are people who are very anti-Russia, very anti-China, very anti-Iran. And so I think that is going to be something that even if, regardless of what happens over the next, say, month and a half during this transition and whatever he's able to achieve then, this already is pointing towards the potential direction for what foreign policy could look like under the Trump administration. So with that, I will go ahead and pause and turn it over now to my colleague, Bobby Gulotty, who's going to talk more about the geopolitical economic implications.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So the Trump administration before one of the main areas they were active was on trade policy. And I think it's important to think about how that reflects broader intentions on the part of the economic plans of the administration going forward as we staff up to the new administration. There's basically two camps within the Trump orbit. Camp number one are basically pro-business CEOs, believers in the international system who believe that the president ought to be using tariffs as a cudgel to enact foreign policy changes. So this would be the justification that Trump uses for the proposed 25% tariff on Canada and the 25% tariff on Mexico. The idea is not that those would be permanent, but rather they'd be there until Canada and Mexico satisfy Trump on other policy grounds. This is a long-standing tool that the president has been authorized by the Congress since the 60s. There's a number of trade acts that authorize the president to raise tariffs at very high amounts, but very temporarily for the purposes of changing foreign policy outcomes. So this would be the Section 301 tariffs that the US uses against China to try to change the sort of foreign policy of, or the protection of American market access for American exporters to access China. This would be trade acts like the 1964 acts, which enable, in an emergency, the president to raise tariffs for national security purposes, which was the justification for the steel tariffs during the first Trump administration. So think of these as policy cudgels designed to change foreign countries' behavior. Theory two is the Lighthizer view, which was also hinted at from Trump's background, that the US economy shouldn't be as open as it was, that the US should basically raise a tariff wall, and behind that we can build an industrial base. So one of the things that tariffs does is it takes resources from consumers and hands it to producers. And the idea was that by handing more production into the United States to producers in the US, that this would create an industrial base that would then reshape the American economy in favor of Americans, in particular, and American workers as well. This sort of perspective was popular in the left and was very exciting for people thinking about the future Trump administration. Some people were thinking, finally, someone will do something to challenge the elites in business and challenge the globalist agenda. In that world, you don't want temporary tariffs. You want tariffs that are both across the board, so you're not just shifting who you're importing from one country to another, and you want them to be permanent in a way that will enable people to make investments and long-run changes in American manufacturing. That view is backed by Trump's former trade advisor, Lighthizer. Lighthizer doesn't have a job in the administration, it turns out. It's the view A that seems to be dominating right now. We don't know in the long run, but right now it looks like Trump is mostly moving to a world in which tariffs are going to be used to impose costs on our trade partners, mostly for the purposes of extracting foreign policy concessions. This is interesting because much of the economic rationale that people point to for why Trump was so successful in his second campaign was this more anti-globalist agenda. But the reality of the situation is that the people he has staffing Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce that he selected, are all pretty traditional pro-business Republicans that do endorse tariffs, but only as this sort of bargaining chip. So they'll characterize Trump's pronouncements as an opening bid, and then they'll encourage foreign countries to come ask for trade concession or ask what we need in order to remove those tariff concessions. I think this suggests, along with Paul, a very transactional presidency again, from a foreign policy perspective, one that other countries have begun to figure out how to deal with, and so maybe they'll continue to do so. And it suggests that the sort of mass industrial policy pitch probably won't be there. And maybe this is just a reflection of the weakness of the Republican Party in the Congress, because any of those actions probably would require actually legislative support and not just actions by the president. So they're going to rely on existing authorities. They're going to use the tariffs as well as they can. Now, what does that mean for all of us and for people around the world? Already, we see that even a threatened 25% tariff can be massively disruptive. We see businesses cutting purchases in advance of the Trump inauguration because he can raise those tariffs as soon as he comes into office. some businesses who think they can get the goods in before the tariffs apply are trying to do as many purchases as they can now, because it takes about a month for a good to travel across the ocean and get it through customs to get it into the United States. So they need to get the stuff in as quickly as possible, and then they're canceling orders for those periods afterwards. This massive level of uncertainty about what's going to happen in trade policy can itself be a massive trade barrier that the president can do unilaterally. The fact that you never know whether you're going to be able to make any money on your products when you send them into your ship means that you're less likely to engage in trade. And so we'll see a general effect, as well as the particular disruptions that occur when these negotiating tariffs gets put in place. The uncertainty levels, it'll be harder to trace to individual policy actions. So it won't be as obvious what the consequences are for individual individual consumers. But we're already seeing that the US is having, firms are basically being forced to react, become more domestic in response to the sort of erratic potential of using trade policy for other policy goals.
So let me just take a couple minutes and just do what I was going to do. So number one, what was I surprised about? I was not surprised, and I'll tell you why, about the fact there's no violence with Trump winning. But I was surprised with the width or the breadth of Trump's victory. I look at this at the county level with our data that we study, and there are 3,100 counties in the United States, and it looks to be as in about 85% of those counties that Trump did much better across the board. Now, the word "much" maybe is, again, I don't mean to say that his width of victory was very large in all of those, but to have that broad brush of county support is really quite something. That's not something any of the polls could have picked up before, but I am really surprised about that. And that means that happened in all the swing states. That happened in the red states, of course. That happened in the red parts of blue states, but that also happened in the most urban areas of the bluest states. So that's really quite, to me, was quite a surprise. And what that means is, and I told for the folks who heard my talk, that I believe that this entire set of events in the last 10 years, Trump's rise, the pushback from the left, the violence, is all basically, in large part, not wholly explained by the fact that we're going through a structural transformation from a white majority democracy to a white minority, truly multiracial democracy. That, I think, accounts for a lot of factors here, not every factor, and of course there's lots of other additional factors accounted for each of the specific events. But I think that what this tells me, this breadth, is that we cannot just assume that we will continue to be a multiracial democracy over the next 10 years. I do believe that pattern will continue, but I don't think we can assume that that will necessarily be a progressive future. I think that, I don't know what that means. I think the progressives also now know that, but I think that's the big thing. The thing I was not surprised about was violence, not being violent. Now, I know that might sound strange because I'm one of the leaders in the whole country telling the world to be careful about violence in this case. But here's why. So on the day of the election in Foreign Affairs, I published a piece. Somebody asked me at Foreign Affairs, did I have more to say? And I said, well, I did. I have one thing I really have been trying to say, but I couldn't, nobody would let me in it, so to speak, with all those pieces, which is, it really is an asymmetric situation with who's going to win. If Harris wins, and this is what I said in the piece, then I do believe there's a very good chance for violence. Fits with a lot of things probably people may already know about. I'm glad to unpack that. But if Trump wins, I didn't think, I say in the piece, I didn't think there would be violence in November or December. That is in the very short term. I think the problems here with Trump's victory and violence are going to happen later after he is president, and could easily start with as a result of the deportations, the mass deportations happening later. And I believe that, and I said that for one reason, and then one fact has come out, which I'll tell you about in a second, And I believe that because Donald Trump had done quite a bit before the election in order to basically prepare the battlefield for violence in the event he lost. He did what he was doing before 2020. He was really setting that stage. Well, what happened with Harris and what happened with Biden is they were doing the exact opposite. And what they were doing from the time of the first Trump assassination, including the second Trump assassination, and then, of course, in the days after the election, is far from preparing the battlefield for violence if they lost. What they were doing is not setting the stage for rigged elections or anything like that. What they were doing is, I have this wildfire analogy I use, that in order for you to get mass political violence, it's helpful to see it as a wildfire, meaning you need the mass kindling, populations ready to kind of explode. And then you also need lightning strikes that are more unpredictable, or campfires left unattended. Well, what Biden and Harris were doing in Oval Office addresses by Biden and phone calls by Harris to Trump himself, they were dousing fire on these kindling, on this smoldering kindling. Now, also, I've been a little coy about this, but now that this is what I can say, I have over a dozen, not over, a dozen times in the Biden administration, I have been in the West Wing, I have been on Zoom with the West Wing, and so this is if you look at my sort of advice about how to deal with political violence here, I can't tell you any of the actual conversations. But what I can tell you is that I don't think there's a single person in the country, a single leader in the country who has been a better exemplar for how to squash political violence than Joe Biden. And I think he did that in multiple tough situations, including weeks when he was basically losing his chance to become the next presidential nominee. And I think that now, I also think we just recently did a survey. This will be the final point. I know I've gone on a little bit long, but 30 more seconds. We did a survey on November 8th and 10th. That is, we planned to do this in advance. We had already done it. We got big support to do this. And this was a survey with NORC. It's one of our big NORC surveys. This time over 4,000 respondents. So it was a super big NORC, so to speak. We covered all the swing states as well. And the bottom line in that is that there's a piece of data there that really, I think, tells the picture of why there was no violence here, which is in our data on do you agree, disagree, that the use of force is justified to prevent Donald Trump from being president? Well, that number was over 10% at the end of June. In September, it was 8.2%. On November 8 and 10, that number fell to 5%, 5.2%. That is the lowest in all the 18 months that we have been doing that tracking. It is basically a pattern. If I showed you the chart of essentially things are flat here, and then starting with our September and then our November, it's like that. And it's hard to know why that exactly happened. We cannot give all the explanations, but that dovetails with, I would say, the campaign by Biden and Harris to douse the idea of political violence as a response to Donald Trump. And then you also saw that Biden didn't just do this in this period of time, but he has gone so far as to meet with Donald Trump publicly, shake his hand. This was a very, very big deal. Jill Biden was willing to meet with Melania. She was not willing to meet with her. That was really quite extraordinary. And so this, of course, has been very controversial. A lot of people are very mad at Biden for this. But the fact is, I think that's why I think we did not have violence. But I don't think that means that we can sit on our hands and say that violence is over or so forth. And I also think this is good evidence that the best tracker we have here is our polls on support for political violence, but it's not a linear relationship the way a lot of, I think, academic modeling wants it to be. It's not a quadratic relationship either. It's a wildfire analogy where you have the kindling, so to speak, that is predictable and measurable. But you also cannot really predict unpredictable lightning strikes and statements by leaders. Those are the things that touch off the kindling. So it's this combination, I believe, that's important.
I'm going to watch the questions as they come in. And when we talked in the dry run, we also talked about the possibility that you all may have questions for one another. But let me go ahead and just get started. I'll just start in order of the speakers that spoke tonight, and I'll start with Ruth. The one thing that's on my mind is, with all of Trump's nominees, what are you expecting? I mean, we've already seen one drop out of the race. We now have another one that's on the bubble, and already there's a potential replacement nominee. What are you expecting in terms of how Congress behaves with these nominations, and will they, go only so far and back or deny Trump one or two and then back the rest, or are they going to put up a fight?
So I think we're likely to see variable behavior. So there are many of Trump's nominees, I think, would have been appointed by any Republican substitute president. They're sort of traditional, as Bobby and Paul have noted. They're individuals who represent factions within the Republican Party that are established on trade or foreign policy, and even on some sort of domestic policy issues. Then there are the individuals who I think are have a more tenuous claim to having subject matter expertise, and that's a place where I think you will see senators. Some reluctance for the Senate, I think, takes their advice and consent responsibility seriously. And, everyone recognizes that this is the opening salvo. And so you have to have a strategy for thinking about if you accept nominees in this context, how deferential are you going to be in future? What are the expectations from the administration on that basis? And so, as we've already seen, there's been some pushback to some individuals, Gates being sort of the most obvious one, where it became clear he was not going to receive a majority of Republican support, and so he pulled out. I don't think we should anticipate particularly brutal hearings, in part because I think individuals who foresee that they're unlikely to survive a Senate confirmation hearing are likely to back out beforehand. But that imagines that staff work among sort of White House legislative liaison is up and running, and they have a good beat on what Republicans in the Senate will and will not countenance. And that's, I think, where we might imagine there will be some potential for what we might imagine is error, where individuals aren't able to anticipate that there is going to be more resistance within the Senate than there otherwise would be. But that's, I think, where, we would imagine there's sort of the Trump factor, where the transition team is perhaps less quick on its feet than other Republican nominations or other Republican presidents. Otherwise, I'd imagine things are going to proceed as they typically would, which is not every Republican pick or not every Democratic pick in administrations are popular, and those folks meet some resistance. It's not unusual to have people drop out. But the vast majority will ultimately be confirmed.
There's already some great questions that have come in from not just the audience that's already on here, but there's also some great questions that were shared ahead of time. And I mean, we can just go straight into it. I think, one of the more, let's go to like one of the more provocative questions. And I would love to hear, Molly and Ruth, your views on this. So one of the most provocative questions that's been shared by the audience is, can the current system prevent Trump from becoming a dictator? That's a very provocative question. It could be, unloaded in a lot of ways. But I think what it points to is kind of what are the constraints that are going to be on Trump, right? And I mean, that was already alluded to a little bit what both of you talked about at the beginning here. But I would love to hear a little bit more about, from your perspective, of what are going to be the kind of constraints that we could see Trump facing. And I think, Bobby, you also spoke to this a little bit, I believe, in the chat there, your question about, the kind of the very kind of the constraints that he's going to have in terms of working with the legislature. So I think that's a great question that the audience, I'm sure a lot of members of the audience are interested about. So I'd love to hear more about that from any of my colleagues here.
I'd love to kind of start off the conversation. I'm sure Ruth and Bobby will have a lot more to say about the institutional constraints. echoing Bobby's comments on the role of policy uncertainty and surprise, I think something that's relatively new and unique about a Trump presidency is the way in which he is able to make policy online, right? So he has his own social media platform now, Truth Social. He's already announced cabinet members on Truth Social and on Twitter. And as Paul said, President Trump is often someone who makes decisions and makes policy based on the most recent person he's talked to. And so this isn't necessarily a question of whether he's able to become an authoritarian ruler, a dictator, but he is able to make policy decisions without necessarily a lot of checks and as a surprise to many other people in the administration. And so Trump's approach to making policy, even within our current institutional system, is quite different. And I think that we'll expect to see this going forward. I think that there are a lot of open questions about his relationship with Elon Musk and what the role of Twitter will be or of X in an upcoming Trump presidency. We've already seen that Musk has been very close with President Trump, that he has accompanied him on campaign trips, that he's had his ear on lots of policy decisions, including the generation of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. So I think that this is going to be a really open question to see, even within our current institutional system, how Trump is able to very independently take policy decisions. But I'll hand it over to Ruth and Bobby to talk a little bit more about the institutional changes that could be possible.
Oh, I'll jump in. So I think one of the interesting things is that in some ways, American government was designed for precisely this problem. So if you go all the way back to the Federalists, the core concern in designing American institutions was to prevent a monarch or a dictator from arising. And so in some ways, we have a set of institutions that are poorly designed to do a bunch of other things, effectively implement policy, pass policy, represent people in sort of the optimal way. But the institutions are well designed, I think, to put guardrails on potential dictators, which Trump may or may not have a desire to be. And so I think it's worth thinking about like what those are and whether we think they are likely to work in this context. So the framers understood that, one of the best ways to prevent dictators was to empower individuals who might also want to be dictators, or put differently, individuals who might also want some of this power. So the idea that ambition should counter ambition. And so if you want to think about guardrails, one of the best guardrails, I think, to preventing what we conventionally understand to be a dictatorship, an individual who is empowered in such a way as to prevent future elections, or for those to be free and fair elections, or to force other institutions within the government to do that which they would not otherwise want to do. We have individuals who have institutional power already within the Republican administration whose interests would deviate from that of the president. So, for example, Vice President J.D. Vance presumably wants to run for president someday. Well, if there aren't elections or those elections are, again, with Trump at the top of the ticket, that's going to limit his ability to do that. And so I think to the extent that you have people who will be no voices in the room, you might expect that some of those individuals would be there. We also have the classic story, which is that Republican justices appointed by Republican lawmakers in the courts would likewise be uncomfortable with seeing some of their power and discretion usurped by the Trump administration. I think the tricky thing for us as observers is to distinguish between instances where the Trump administration is pushing people to do that which they wouldn't want to do, and in that way sort of edging closer to a dictatorship, and simply a Republican Party consensus as to the direction they want to go, which may deviate from presumably what Democrats want, but also what a very large minority, or possibly even a majority of American voters, the public, would want. And there, I think that's trickier. It may appear, if Republican lawmakers and the Trump administration and Republican justices all want the same thing, that the sort of different institutions are bowing to whatever the Trump administration wants. And that may not be an accurate picture as to what's happening. There may be more consensus among Republicans who currently have majorities in all three branches of government. And so that's, I think, the tricky thing for us to know. And then the last thing I'll say is that, if you're worried about that, even as early as 2 months before Trump takes office, there's already plenty of reports about Republicans disagreeing over policy questions. And so I think the odds of that really transpiring in that way are fairly low, except for issues where there is broad consensus, which, as I'm thinking about it, it's hard to put my finger on one particular one. So I think, in that way, the system is going to work the way it's supposed to, which is, no one is all that thrilled about seeing one individual take away power they might be able to use. But maybe, Bobby, you disagree.
I think in general, when we think about dictatorial powers in the United States, the only place the place that holds the most is in foreign policy, where the president is given wide-ranging authorities by Congress basically Congress delegating or derogating its authority, basically giving up authority to the president. And Trump will, even if he doesn't manage to change any legislation, be able to use a wide variety of authorities given to him over the years by Congress in that area first. So this is where I was talking about in trade policy. He's not going to be able to do transformative change in terms of like creating tariff walls, but he will be able to use emergency tariff acts that enable him to put 25, 30, 40% tariffs on trade partners, allegedly for the purposes of negotiating market access or for other goals. So there in some sense, there's no check on his activities. And I suspect that's where he'll tend to spend his efforts. In other areas of foreign policy, he's staffed up mostly with loyalists. Whatever sort of hawkish or dovishness the features of these people have, the main feature that they all have is a personal commitment to Donald Trump and his following his policy orders. So I think that's another area where we have to be careful about presidential authority. The last thing I'll say here, and related to what Professor Offer-Westort was talking about with the information environment, a crucial feature of democracy is that the people don't get to really know what's going on in Washington directly. They need to rely on the media and other intermediaries to pass on information from what's going on in Washington to what's going on in their lives. And one of the things that's going on that's a little bit worrying is that because of the sort of economics of media, the way that there's been a nationalization of media, all the local newspapers are shutting down, people don't have resources to invest in these sorts of things. It's basically come down to the whims of a few billionaires, what the nature of media accountability looks like. And we see this as part of the political strategy of Trump to side with some of those billionaires against the others. And it becomes, I think this is a danger that we're going to face moving forward, that we're going to lose the ability to have accountability. And I think if Elon Musk is dangerous, in one way that he is he tells people via his platform X, you are the media now. As if the average citizen has any access to what's going on in Washington, like can make evaluations of the internal workings of the Defense Department actions. So I just find this to be dangerous, because we need these people to collect the information, distill it in a way that people can understand in order to hold anybody accountable for the actions of government. I do have a question on this regard about like Trump loyalists and like dictatorship for Paul. So you mentioned a bunch of Russia hawks. There was also an interesting selection for the Director of National Intelligence. What do you think of this?
No, this is another one of those picks that we will remain to be seen how well that plays out. But yes, Stefanik is someone who has had questionable relationship with the intelligence community in the past, which may very well point to why Trump has appointed. We can also think about Trump's FBI FBI pick, and about kind of a similar vein, which actually points to another question that I have, I have thoughts on, but I think this intersects very well with the domestic and the international, especially the tariff side of things, which is a big thing that Trump came in on. And one of the first things he did was, of course, he put together this blue ribbon committee of Elon, and Vivek of going to, which of course has led to a bunch of memes about, the efficiency department. Who is the great individual who will determine this efficiency and how best to streamline the government? Actually, it'll be two individuals, so it's of course led to great memes on this. But what are the prospects of this? Like, this seems to be a big thing that Trump wants to achieve and is kind of reducing the size of the federal government dramatically. And that includes all aspects of the federal government. This relates then, Bobby, to your question about like why appoint people who are skeptical of the intelligence community. Well, to me, I view it as it's the same idea of let's try to reduce size of the government, and then let's just fund it all through tariffs, right? We can do that. We can get rid of the IRS as well. I have my own views on how successful that would be, but I would love to hear everybody's views on like, is this going to be something, could that be his big legacy? Or is this just a big, like a lot of posturing? And at the end of the day, really nothing's going to happen. Maybe a few small agencies get reformed, a few people get early severance or something of that nature. But I think this is going to be, because that has big implications for both US domestic policy and foreign policy. If it was the case that the US government is reduced in size by 75%, that could just dramatically alter everything. But is that actually going to happen? I'd love to hear my colleagues' views on that. And we can start, Bob. Let's start with you.
So I don't have a prediction about the size that's going to go down, but I'd like to offer two thoughts that relate to this. So one is, I think that the election has had an effect on our norms of democracy related to restraint. So that's a big norm we talk about, restraint in the use of force. And I think that the most negative effect of the election outcome itself is that the fact that there was no one more integral to January 6th and the violence on January 6th and what January 6th meant to the threat to our democracy than Donald Trump. Nobody was more important than that. And what's happened is, even though it's only 50.5% or something, but half of the country who votes is okay with that now. That, I think, is a big issue. And I think that what that means for Trump's supporters is that, I think, is what's putting a lot of wind in their sails. It's not just the deflation of Democrats. There's a lot of wind in their sails because oh my gosh, the country's really down for this. Now, does that mean they'll be using, sort of how far they'll go? I don't know that I could say that, or I'm not sure anybody does, but I do think it means there'll be a lot of wind in that sails that won't be restrained by that idea. At least that sliver of it is now important. The second thing I would say is, I think the guardrail then that's really going to matter a lot is maybe not even in Washington, D.C., which is going to be basically a political battleground. I think it's going to be our federal system. So the biggest protection that we have right now, I think, for being a democracy is with the institution of our elections, and who runs our national elections is not the Washington. It's not the federal government or the state governments. And so in order to really, if there's a lot of bad things, I think, that could happen and harms that can happen. I don't mean to diminish those. But what I think is there's a guardrail that we may now see that is really going to come to the fore in the next few years, which is our federal system. You already see governors pushing back on this. They're already on the deportations, are already promising the sort of court fights like you've never seen before. But I think beyond that, I think the fact that the states really handle our elections, that is our election for president, and other national elections, will turn out to be a real guardrail here in ways that I think we've known about, but I don't think have been quite as important going forward.
Anybody else want to pick up on this? Should we expect a big reduction in the federal government, or even more of a reliance on, say, sub-national levels of governments, to hence pick up on Bob's last point here?
One thing I would say is that under the first administration, one of the things they floated was two administrative changes. One is eliminating tenure, essentially, for government employees to make it easier to fire people. I suspect that would be mostly used to select loyalists and not to shrink the overall size of government. More of a way of establishing patronage networks, essentially. I think the other thing they did was they spread government agencies across the United States as an effort to basically make them less attractive to work in and encourage quitting, essentially, as a way of shrinking the size of the workforce. I think they're going to try to do that as well. I don't think they have a large enough House majority or consensus among the Republicans to say exactly what they would cut of major government resources, right? I can't really imagine them finding a way to cut veterans assistance, like the Social Security thing did campaign on not doing. They could try, but I think that'd be a big ask for the MAGA folks to back that sort of thing. I don't see anything that they're talking about as working at all, unless they want to go after the Department of Defense, which they could try, but that's a really politically difficult thing to do. And so I think all of it's going to fail, just as all previous efforts to do the same thing have failed. Like, this isn't the first time that governments, presidents have brought in business leaders to try to right-size government. This is a long-standing tradition within the Republican Party, and this one will probably go the same way as all those others, which is nowhere.
Ruth or Molly, did you want to offer anything on this?
I just wanted to echo one of the questions that was put into the chat about how there have been different messaging put out there in terms of Trump initially discussed a 60% tariff on imports, then announced a 10% tariff on Truth Social. So I think that there's just a lot of uncertainty about what the actual goals are. I think that we'll continue to see consequences of that uncertainty, but I'm also skeptical about what will actually end up happening.
I would also add, I think one of the interesting things and is by creating this sort of independent czar, or not independent, but sort of beyond or to the side of the administration per se, with Ramaswamy and Musk, is that, you know, one nice thing for Trump is that it's easier to distance himself from unpopular calls that this sort of advisory committee is able to offer. And so I think, you know, to the extent that, to Paul's question, right, this is a lot of talk. And to the extent that that talk is popular, the Trump administration can, you know, say, look at our great people. And to the extent that it's not, which I think a vast majority of it will be for a variety of different reasons, then there's opportunities to kind of push back. And so if you thought that the administration was very serious about cutting, sort of constraining the bureaucracy, you might imagine sort of keeping it more closely tethered to the Oval Office. And so the creation of a sort of independent group in this way is, I think, deliberate, and in that way, I think, indicates sort of just how much this is about signaling as opposed to sort of trying to accomplish anything.
Well, Paul, could I ask the panel one follow-on question to where we're heading right now?
Absolutely.
So it looks like everybody kind of agrees that ultimately the effort here to dismantle government will fail. But what do you think over the next, say, year, 18 months before the midterms, not the results in the midterms, but what do you think will be the sort of consequences of a kerfuffle like this in Washington over the next 18 months? What do you think will be the consequences if the government is kind of tied in knots, so to speak, over this issue? And many different parts of government are tied in knots over this issue over the next 18 months, for domestic, for international. How will allies respond, do you think, to this kerfuffle? That is, I think that there's, you know, sort of, even if ultimately this actually doesn't get very far, what will be the results of simply the effort of Trump to try?
No, I'm glad you asked that question, because that was actually where my mind was going, was like, if we were to have this panel a year from now, what would we be talking about? Like, you know, how would we be assessing that first year? And so, I mean, I could take a first stab at this, which is
perfect, Paul.
To me, and this very much echoes a lot of the points that were raised at the beginning, especially, you know, as Ruth was laying out, like exactly how knife edge this election result was, which is, I think it's very important that the Republicans not overinterpret this election result as a mandate. That's a phrase that has been used. Oh, we have a mandate now to go out and reduce the size of the federal government and pursue a more aggressive U.S. foreign policy if we wish, and impose 60% tariffs. And it's like, they need to be very careful not to interpret this as a mandate. And at the same time, the Democrats need to be, I think, very careful to not overinterpret of, oh, what did we do wrong? What was our messaging? How did we mess this up? Oh, maybe it was those particular ads there and there. I think a big point of context is that this year has been the year of the election globally. I think there's been more elections that have taken place this year than in any year in history. And moreover, according to data that was collected by the Financial Times, they showed that every single incumbent party globally has lost vote share during this year. That didn't mean they lost the election. They may have still won the election, but they've lost vote share. What it points to is the overall headwinds that incumbents have been facing this year due to inflation and some of the after effects that we're still experiencing economically from COVID. And so I think because of that, there's very strong structural factors that help explain a lot of what just took place in terms of the US election that's no different than anywhere else in the world. And so it's very important for the sides to not overreach and not overreact. And I think the danger then, to bring it back to your question, Bob, is you could see where the Republicans, if they interpret this as, oh, we've got a mandate, we're going to do this and this, and Trump's like, I'm going to promise this and promise that. If he's not able to deliver on those things, which I think I'm getting very much the sense from the panel here that, yeah, there's going to be a lot of this he's not going to be able to deliver on. Foreign policy might be one area because of the factors that Bobby laid out. And then as a result, the midterms are going to not be very favorable towards the Republicans. And there's going to be a lot of frustration. You're going to see a decline in his approval rating. So that's that's the way that I'm thinking about the current situation with this and about that context. But again, I'd love to, I kind of love that idea of like, what do my colleagues think it's going to unfold?
Yeah, let me jump in real quick. Just one small thing. So the most important issue that's going to face America between now and the midterms is that there's going to be an expiration of Trump's tax cuts, which will mean in this necessary debate about tax policy, which means that America will be mired in a fight about how much it's spending on American stuff, which will mean the deprioritization of all foreign policy issues, for sure. All right. Which means that America is not going to be thinking about our commitments to South Korea, to the question here, if there's an emergency in South Korea, how many troops? It's not going to be on the main line. It's not going to be the headline stuff that we're going to be thinking about. Instead, we're going to be fighting about tax cuts and potentially government default as a bargaining chip on the tax cuts, or other, back and forths about billionaires and like all the poor people that won't be able to eat or whatever. That will be the main thrust of the debate. And so for the rest of the world, they're going to be sitting waiting for what's effectively going to be another round of stimulus, which will then have massive financial implications for all of the rest of the world that they have no say in. So that's I think what's going to happen between now and the midterms for the rest of the world, is they're going to be sitting waiting to see how large of a stimulus American tax cuts are passed by the new bipartisan tax cut policy that will then flood the world with cheap money again and create another round of challenges for everybody else.
I want to second what Bobby said and say, I think this actually applies more broadly. So the fight over tax policy and the size of the deficit is going to inform all the other substantive policy debates that are had within the administration. And particularly, I think top of the line here is the debate over immigration. So estimates, both by the Trump administration and by outside observers, is that the deportation scheme that's possibly being imagined and that we see in Texas as being quite costly. And so any conversation about spending will be within the context of what money the government is going to be taking in. And so that's going to be informed by whatever tax debate works its way through. I think, if you were a betting person, you would say the one thing that Republicans seem capable of agreeing on is tax policy. This is one place where even with narrow majorities and sort of the factional politics, they've been able to come to yes on tax policy. And so you might imagine that those Trump tax cuts will maybe not be made permanent, but again, sort of rolled over for another period of time. And that's going to limit the government's revenue. And so again, that's going to constrain what Trump is able to accomplish in other sort of costly policy moves like immigration. And again, assuming that they're not able to free up a lot of funds by dramatically altering the size of the federal government, which, as we've talked about, I think is unlikely.
So I want to echo what my colleagues have said and say that I really do think it's just going to come down to the economy and specifically in terms of how people personally experience their economic situation relative to where they are now. And people are not good economic analysts in terms of being able to attribute causal effects to economic policies. They're going to place responsibility on whoever is in power over the last year. And so the Republicans have an electoral mandate, and they are going to be in a situation where they'll have to take some amount of responsibility for the economic situation, even if the economic situation that people are experiencing a year from now is based on policies that were made during the Biden administration, right? It takes a long time for these macroeconomic policies to take effect. And so I think that is going to be, as others have said, the really big question in terms of how tax policy affects people directly and personally. That's going to be a really important question. For immigration, a lot of the concerns around immigration are about economic uncertainty, are about employment issues. And so I think everything to me is going to be seen through this lens of the economy. And we saw that in this election, that the US is doing relatively well economically on a global scale, but people are experiencing a lot of economic uncertainty. And that's what people said was their primary reason in this election for voting how they did, is that they felt economic uncertainty and they felt that they were in a bad situation financially.
So if I could just add that, those are really brilliant remarks by everybody. If I could just add a couple thoughts of my own about what the kerfuffle in Washington means, and I'll talk about international impact. I think one of the big things that's going to happen with this kerfuffle in the Defense Department and in the intelligence community is we're going to start to experience the lack of really excellent information. We talk about this all the time with the decline of our newspapers in the public, how we can't get good information anymore. Well, that's not really been true inside of the US government. On Tuesdays, I was at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and at the end, we had a Chatham House Rules Zoom with the #1 person in the White House on the Middle East, the absolute #1 person. And it was all about Syria. And he explained, and I can't say the details, but imagine the detail you get in the New York Times 100-fold. And it's because he was able to call. I mean, he's literally saying, I mean, it was unbelievable what they were able to, the picture of specificity they were able to put together, and also gradations of confidence in just a couple of, like 96 hours, he said. I mean, this has really been an enormous thing. Well, when you talk about this kerfuffle in Washington and what it means, I think, for how Washington works, one of the things I don't think we give enough credit to is just the quality of information that is fed into Washington. That comes from the State Department, the Defense Department, our intelligence community, the Treasury Department. This is not just a single, it's not just one spy in Putin's ear or something. And so you take that whole system and you kaboom it here, which and even if it's only kaboomed like 5 or 10% here, that's a pretty big disruption. And I think what that means is then now Trump himself may love chaos, so he may feel, oh, that's absolutely wonderful for him. But I think in terms of even trying to get a grip on what should be the best policy with, say, what happened in South Korea on Tuesday as well, this really requires the ability to have excellent information. And it's not just one phone call to one leader, like Trump gets on one phone. This is not what that means. And I think this is really going to then be an albatross around America's neck here in ways that I don't think it's going to be easy to foresee. And precisely because I think our information picture is about to become much cloudier.
No, I think it's an excellent point, Bob, about like kind of the value added of having the bureaucracy, the information, both and also domestically too. You know, you focus on the foreign policy, but understanding, you know, the United States is a large country. How do you keep track of what's going on? How do you think about the best effects? And it's important to have this bureaucracy provides that function. We have just a few more minutes, but I know there was a variety of questions, you know, our audience asked either in the Q&A during the session or sent along ahead of time. I just want to, is there a question that any of my colleagues here think that, you know, we haven't touched on or something we haven't, you know, gone into enough yet that you think would be worth us touching on before we're done here?
There, in the Q&A here, there was a question about what the climate policies would be for the incoming Trump administration, and whether it'd just be him selling national parks for drilling. I assume that's meaning the licenses to drill in national parks. So I'll just briefly say, the number one priority of Project 2025 was to eliminate the word climate from every single agency in every single part of government. They would do just a Control F and find anytime climate was there and eliminate it. And there's no reason to think that won't happen. But the other reality is, because of just natural changes in the economy in the United States, and because of billions of dollars in investments by the Biden administration, the US is on a path to consuming less carbon. But the big question is whether there could be anything done about the building of new coal plants in India and China and the rest of the developing world. And that requires international coordination and money that I don't think that, even if they wanted to, given their other priorities of cutting taxes, would be anywhere on the Republican agenda. So the US is going to basically remove itself as a leader in this space. And I think the path will have to, the weight will have to be borne by the rest of the world as the US just sits on its hands in this area.
Anyone else? Another question? I also see that Mark, you're
Well, the
coming
one thing
back
I
on.
guess
Oh,
I'd like
go
to
ahead,
say
Bob.
about
Yeah.
Asia, if I could. So it's a question about Asia. I think there are two big international winners as leaders here. One is Netanyahu, the second is Xi, and I think China is a big winner out of this election. And the reason is not because Trump's going to be pro-China. It's actually the opposite. He will be anti-China. But everything we're talking about with the bureaucracy and the military and the intelligence community is going to be really crucial for the defense of Taiwan. So what's just about to happen, I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but if you have like a general's board and you fire a third of your generals, for example, that means also a third of your admirals. That means you're really going to wreak havoc on the command authority that we have for months within the military. So the idea that we're going to be able to coordinate a 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, 12-month defense of Taiwan, the way our plans really call for, is just going to be very, 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 very difficult. Now, that's not to say we can't do airstrikes. So this is going to be something, Trump will move to short-term things like airstrikes he can do. But that's not what we mean with the defense of Taiwan. The defense of Taiwan really would require as the Pentagon sees it, a protracted scenario over time. And I think that our ability now over the next 18 months to do that is getting weaker, even as we're putting China hawks around Trump. And it's because I don't think you can basically take a meat axe to the Pentagon, the intelligence community, the way that Trump is talking about, without disrupting protracted operations in particular. And so any scenario that requires that is going to be I think it's just been undermined. Is it come completely apart? I would not say that, but I think that this is a big winner here for Xi, and I'm not going to be surprised if our Asian allies get very nervous in the next 6 to 9 months here, and maybe that's enough to cause Trump to pull back from pulling this meat axe to the bureaucracy. But I do believe they're going to get pretty nervous.
I think we have time, maybe just real quick, Ruth or Molly, is there anything else that you think would be important for our audience to hear before we wrap up here?
Can I just ask what Ruth thinks will be the effect here among Americanists in our field as American politics? If you wouldn't mind, just you're probably more deeply in those circles than any of us are, or maybe Molly is too. I don't know. I don't know as much, but Ruth, I'm just curious. I had this conversation with Mark Hansen in our department. I'd just be curious to know what you think. Is this, what will be the consequences of this election for like academic American politics, if any? I don't know.
That's a good question. I'm very bad at assessing disciplinary trends, as my own work implies. But what I would say is, I don't know what will happen, but I know I have some views about what should happen. I think what this suggests is that there's some really interesting questions about sort of the role of persons in government versus sort of the institutional constraints implied. So this is this sort of tension between agents and, the sort of you could imagine just picking any individual and putting them in their place, and the institutional constraints would lead them because of the sort of structural incentives to behave in the same way. And I think the Trump administration and some of these intra-party and inter-party dynamics suggest that that's a ripe area to study. We can't just assume, looking across history, that you could plug anyone into a similar set of circumstances and they would all behave in the same way, which leads us to have to think, I think, carefully about sort of what's happening inside people's heads, which matters at the level of a voter, but then also at the level of individuals within Congress or the presidency or the courts. And so we need to do more to better understand how these individuals are behaving and what makes them distinctive, which I think, and this is my own soapbox, is it requires that we do more than sort of extract high level observational data, but that we actually engage with these individuals as people, which requires that we speak to them, that we observe their behavior, and that we get sort of closer to the action. And that's often difficult, but I think will be really important to be able to sort of anticipate what would a generic Republican or generic Democrat do, and how is that different or similar from the individuals we have in office.
I want to just say briefly that I think one of the works of the study of political science in the United States is that we have American politics as a subfield, which studies, we have many scholars who are real experts on the specifics of American institutions, American electoral procedures, et cetera. And then we have a separate subfield, which is comparative politics, which often means the study of politics within every other country in the world. And we've seen already a lot of scholars of comparative politics have a lot to say about what could be happening going forward in the US as they studied other electoral systems in other countries and other historical situations, and understand what can happen when there are different types of leaders, different shifts in power. And so I think it would be a great thing for political science if there continues to be more discourse across the subfields. And I do think that we'll continue to see that kind of back and forth.
Terrific. Yeah, I'm always a
I
big
think
fan
that's
of American
really
politics.
terrific.
It's just a subfield of comparative.
I think it's really going to be great, and who knows, maybe a year from now we will be coming back to give some thoughts. Mark, we should turn things back over to you here, but before you, I would just like to say a huge thanks to the panelists here, not just for today, not just for helping me out here personally today, but also just over these months here. I think it's just been a phenomenal series. I think you've all brought enormous insights here. And I think it shows really the great strengths of Chicago. And I really do believe that this is one of the silver linings of the pandemic, that we should be doing more with Zoom and opportunities as we speak to the world. And I think it would just be wonderful for the world. I also think it's wonderful for us as a group. So I hope you found it as enlightening as I did. And before Mark, also, I'd like to say a big thanks to our audience here. Many of them have continued here over this, and it's just been a really wonderful thing.
Well, Bob, I'd like to second everything you just said. And on behalf of myself and the staff here in Hong Kong, I'd like to thank each of our faculty members who have made this series a great success. I know we have one other episode. I'm going to touch on that in a bit, but I understand it is the last week of class. So for the faculty who are teaching this week, I know you probably have to run, but my deepest thanks for this is a very complex subject, and we can only, touch on so many things in each of these programs. So Paul, I hope that what you said earlier about coming back in a year, or you're welcome anytime, actually, to come back anytime and help enlighten us a little bit more on what may be going on within this new administration. So for the audience, we're resuming our post-event surveys, which we were doing for a while and then stopped doing. So you should see something come on your screen here shortly that you can use to give us a little feedback on the program, on the series, if you like. And in the meantime, some housekeeping. Next week, our campus will host a very special event it's a lecture and a concert called The Refugee and Renaissance Man, Solomon Bard. That will be on Tuesday, December 12th at 5 p.m. Hong Kong time. And that's in conjunction with the exhibition, which has been supported by the Hong Kong Jockey Club, also on Solomon Bard. Our faculty director, Ken Pomerantz, will give a lecture about Bard's contributions to Hong Kong throughout the decades. And the event will also showcase a variety of written music from Europe, China, Australia, performed on both Western and Eastern instruments. So it should be quite an interesting program. The staff's been working hard on it, and I hope you can join us for that. And of course, as I mentioned, a reminder about the exhibition, Refugee and Renaissance Man, Solomon Bard and his 60 years in Hong Kong, sharing Solomon Bard's extraordinary life journey from refugee to doctor and cultural leader. That's open until January 2nd of 2025. And as I mentioned, I referred to just a moment ago, we'll be working with Professor Pape again, together with the global centers. So we're bringing in our UChicago Beijing Center and Delhi Center, partnering with our Hong Kong campus here on January 9th, 2025. The details are yet to be ironed out, but Professor Pape will come back as we approach the inauguration of President Trump and the new administration. And Professor Pape will discuss Trump's victory and what it means to democracy and America, including domestic and international stability, instability, if you will, economic sanctions, et cetera. So please stay tuned for that program in January. This will be, we do one of our programs, the one I just mentioned with Solomon Bard. The lecture will be hybrid online. So that will be the only hybrid online program that we'll have between now and the New Year. So thank you so much for joining us this year and this evening especially. Again, once again, thank you so much to all of our faculty. Have a great night, great day, wherever you may be.